Thank you. I'm going to speak in English because the slides are in English. So this is a quick summary of a paper I presented at Sintra this summer. It's about the history and the future of European productivity, and I think it resonates very well with Mario Draghi's report. I'm going to show you very briefly one part of the results. So first, Philippe showed that already, but just so that you have the figure in mind again, this is the relative GDP per capita in Europe as opposed to the US. And the goal is that you can see that from 1980, mid-1980s, there is a widening gap between Europe and GDP in terms of Europe and the US in terms of GDP per capita, but we can go a little bit further with the data, and we can in fact decompose this gap into few parts that explain exactly the trade-off that we face in Europe. So if you look at the very right part of the graph, what you can see is that so GDP per capita is the product of labor productivity and labor utilization. And if you want GDP per capita in Europe to be catching up with the level of the US, you need more productivity. And the reason for that is that if you look at the green and blue areas, they are negative, meaning that Europe has a strong preference for leisure compared to the US. We work less than Americans. And the issue is that without TFP, without productivity, this also means that we will have less GDP per capita. So this graph is a little bit complicated, but what it shows is that it's important for us Europeans to think about our productivity because we clearly work less than Americans. And as a result, we have a lower GDP per capita. We can look then at the trend in labor productivity, and they are actually even more dramatic than what we see for GDP per capita. This is labor productivity. This is the amount of value added that are created with 1 hour of work in Europe, in the euro area to be exact, and in the US. And you see that in 1995, the levels are quite similar. They are around 45, 50 euros. And it has been, diverging since then. And nowadays, the level is about, close to half what we have in the US. There's many debate as whether, those numbers could be actually compared. But even if you focus only on Europe, if you only focus on the euro area, something that is quite striking is that the trend of labor productivity after the pandemic has declined quite significantly. Or the labor productivity has deviated from its trend, and the trend was already negative compared to the US. So we already grew lower and slower than the US, and since the pandemic, this has gotten much worse. So the question is what happened around the 1980s, 1990s. This is where we started to diverge with the US. And one thing that we can see from the data already is that it's mostly explained by sectors that use IT or produce IT more than others. So if you split the economy into two categories of sectors, those that are intensive in IT and the other one, and you look at the labor productivity in those sectors, what you see is that, and these are the solid lines, what you see is that above median sectors in terms of IT usage is where the divergence is the most striking. And labor productivity was multiplied by about 2 in the US in those sectors, and in Europe it's only an increase of 30%. In the rest of the economy, there is still a slight divergence that you can see, but nothing completely dramatic. Most of the effect comes from sectors that use IT more. So why is that? Philippe mentioned industrial policy, and Philippe explained what were the engine of growth before the 1990s. And I think they were not efficient enough to have Europe as a whole or European countries succeed in doing the transition toward this new wave of technology that arrived, which is IT. One of the reasons is that clearly we don't invest enough in R&D. This is R&D expenditures in 4 important regions: Europe, Japan, US, and China. And you see that Europe is clearly behind Japan and the US. And as is now well known, this is not an issue of public expenditures. Actually, R&D spending by the public sectors are about the same in Europe and in the US. It's a bit less than 1% of GDP. The main question is why this 1% of GDP that is invested by public institutions and public sectors in Europe do not generate more R&D expenditures in the private sectors. And essentially the question is that this is mostly an issue of the allocation and the way these spendings are invested in the economy. And it would take a lot of time to discuss innovation policy and industrial policies in Europe, but essentially this ended up with what the Fuest et al. Report called the middle technology trap. There's not enough entry, there's not enough renewed of the innovative actors. You can see it very clearly when you look at the top patenting firms in Europe and in the US. In 2005, you can see that those are the 5 most innovative firms in terms of patent filing in the US and in Europe. These are essentially, comparable firms, manufacturing firms. If you look at the same ranking in 2023, in Europe, you see the exact same firms. In the US, you see firms that are mostly in the digital sectors, and some of them, were very, very young in 2005. So there is not enough entry, not enough competition, at least when you look at the top innovative firm in Europe, and there is no transition in terms of who are doing innovation, which firms are doing the most innovation, toward more digital sectors. We can look even more micro. This is looking at a very specific type of patent. This is patents filed in computer vision, which is arguably a very important high-tech, especially for the AI revolution. If you look at who originated the patents in this technology, you can see that at the beginning of the 2000s, this was pretty much, 1/3 in Europe, and most of them were already in the US, a little bit in Japan. And as we go through 2019, which is the last data point, you can see that the rise of China essentially was done at the expense of Japan and the euro area. And today, most of the production in computer vision is done in China and in the US. The same can be done if you look at AI patents. Euro area filed on average 450 patents in AI a year. That's about 1/3 of what is done in the US and half of what is done in China. So we are not producing enough of the technologies that are high-tech and that are the ones that are probably going to help us take up the next productivity wave that is already probably happening. But there are some things that are specific to Europe, and that's a bit of a silver lining. First, Europe has the talent to produce knowledge and frontier knowledge. In fact, if you look at who were the researchers that created the knowledge that were used in those patents in computer visions that are essentially filed in the US and China, there are about 30% of those researchers that work in Europe. So, and it's to generate a bit less than 10% of the patent. So there is a lot of the knowledge that is used by American firms and by Chinese firms that is generated in Europe universities. And the same applies with AI. If you look at the origin of AI academic paper, the really basic of the research that created those large language models or those AI products that we use, a lot of this is done in Europe. If you pile up all the orange areas, you get to exactly the same level as in the US. And that's weighted by citation. And that includes papers that were used by Google and OpenAI to create transformers and OpenAI. So in Europe, we have the talent, we have the ability to create knowledge. What's missing is that it doesn't translate to commercializable technology that are produced by European firms. We are also leading in green technology. If you look at green patents, Europe produces a lot of green patents, actually just at the same level as China, but much more than in the US. And finally, Europe has also some regions that are extremely productive. In orange here, you see regions that are more productive than the average American region, than the average productivity in the US. So as you can see, most of them are either in Switzerland, Austria, or Netherlands and Belgium. But there are some regions in Europe that are extremely productive. If you look at total factor productivity and how it developed over the past 70 years, you can see that some countries in Europe are actually not far away from the level of the US. Netherlands, Austria, Sweden, those are countries that invest a lot in R&D. Those are countries that manage to create some kind of ecosystem that make them productive and allow them to some extent compete in terms of productivity with the US. So what can be done? And that will be my last slide. I think it's quite clear that Europe has a lot of leakage that goes to the US. We are losing investment, especially investments that are going to high-tech firms. And that's clearly because high-tech firms are way more profitable in the US than in Europe. So why would European investors invest in European firms? They will go directly to the US. We are losing skilled workers to the US. We are losing entrepreneurs to the US. And we are also losing good ideas that are produced in European universities that are used by American firms. And I think we should think about building policies that are consistent with our European characteristics as opposed to trying to make us behaving exactly like Americans. One clear thing that we can see from what happened in Europe is that we have good researchers, we have good laboratories, and we have research that is at the frontier. So we should design R&D policies that are, incentivize more collaboration between the private and the public sectors. I've worked on an example in France called the LabEx. This is a program that has been implemented in 2010. And this is a program that incentivized public laboratories to collaborate with private firms in exchange for some direct subsidies. And it worked very well. Like if you look at the output in terms of patenting, in terms of R&D expenditures, you can see that firms started to collaborate more with researchers, and that generated new ideas at a cost that is much lower than those horizontal subsidies that are used in most European countries to try to push firms to innovate more. So I think we should focus more on targeted policies that will use this vehicle of pushing collaboration between public labs and private firms. The second thing is that some European regions are productive. And there is, I think, a trade-off between the way we think about the role of Europe in trying to design those spatial cohesion policy and try to send fundings to the less productive and the less developed areas in Europe, as opposed to building a strategy that would be efficient in terms of developing the new technologies that probably involve redirecting part of these fundings towards the more productive regions. And that's, I'm not so sure that we can do both. So at some point, I think we should open the debate of whether we want to develop, to be at the frontier, to create a new Silicon Valley, or to create an Airbus of battery. And that probably means that we need to redirect a lot of investment to Netherlands, to Belgium, to Austria, which are the more productive area. And the last thing is that Europeans are clearly risk adverse if we look at the profile of our investment. And so probably we should reinforce to some extent public investment banking or public investors that will create new ways of financing high-tech firms that are probably more in line with risk aversion that is at play in Europe. And my last point was about AI. Not going to be too long on AI, but there's, maybe a big opportunity with AI because we know AI is very likely to generate huge productivity gains. But I think, and that's in line a bit with papers that have been done at Collège de France by Philippe in particular, if we just use AI as a tool, like existing AI product as a tool to automate some of our tasks, and if we just take off-the-shelf products that are very easy to adopt, the gains in terms of productivity are going to be existing but not substantial. Maybe 1%, 2% in the next 10 years, that's not enough to be comparable to previous technological wave that we experience in Europe or in the US. And I think that if we want to benefit the most from the gains from AI, we need to be at the frontiers also in terms of producing those new products that will be more tailored to European needs, to European regulation, and to exactly the type of usage that European firms will need to do with AI. Thank you very much.
Thank you.